Today we're working on a 2001 Nissan Sentra. This video is mostly going to be about replacing a lower control arm, but we're also going to be replacing the inner and outer tie rods on this vehicle and both front struts. And the reason for that is they got in a little accident. Said they weren't going too fast, but they did hit a curb. So assessing the damage, you can see right here the tie rod is bent, and then the lower control arm is pretty banged up. So those are going to be the main things. So the first step is to replace these items, and then we'll get it on the alignment rack to see what other things may or may not need to be replaced. So lower control arm, if that's what you're doing on your vehicle, this will be what you want to watch. So first, for me, things are going to be kind of bound up. I may cut this off, but if you don't have that issue, then the first thing to do is to take off this cotter pin for the tie rod and then buzz that nut off. What I have found successful in getting cotter pins out is a pair of side cutters, and you can get, let me switch hands. Once you get just a little bit sticking out, you can get kind of a bite on it and then twist, pulling up. Let me see if I have enough bite already. And that gets cotter pins out pretty easy. Sometimes cotter pins, especially if they've been in there a long time, can be kind of a pain to get out, but the socket for the tie rod is a 19mm. So that came off pretty easy, so I'm happy with that. Next, I'm going to come to the strut tower. These are 17mm bolts, and then this clip comes out to remove the hose. And you can just use a screwdriver or something to get in there and then pop that clip out. It moves in that direction. For that, hose gets removed. These get, and then the strut tower can be removed from the knuckle, and then that'll get this knuckle some free play. Once the strut tower is removed, that allows the knuckle to move and wobble around pretty freely. So next we'll go ahead and take the center nut out of the axle, and that is 30mm. And so we'll buzz that off, and it also had a cotter pin too, so take that out first and then buzz that off. I already had it, just a tip, put some penetrating fluid, anything, liquid wrench is what I use, but any kind of penetrating fluid on it, let it soak. This is a little rusty, so it'll be interesting pulling off. But so once the nut zipped off, I like to thread it back on and then tap it with my hammer. That way I don't mess up any threads or anything, just to get it to come out the back. And then that even more so allows this to be moved really freely, because next we want to, let's see, for me, I might just take the whole knuckle off with the control arm all together, because the way it's banged up, I can't really get to that, well, that lower ball joint. But it doesn't matter if it comes off together with the knuckle or separate, but either way, we want to separate the CV axle from it all anyway. Let me pull this off. They make these, let me see, with the center hole in it for an impact hammer if you need to. And really there's not a whole lot of particular order. This is just kind of, you know, remove this, remove that, remove that. So the order isn't crazy important, but one thing I could have done sooner was take the brake caliper and all that assembly off. And that is 19mm here and here on the bottom. So 19mm, and then the whole bracket and caliper needs to get separated, and then you can hang it on the strut spring there just to get it out of the way. So that needs to come off next. I went ahead and pushed the CV axle through, so now the knuckle's just hanging on the lower ball joint here, so we can really have good access. It's a cotter pin that comes out, and then a 22mm for that nut, and then we can zip that off, and then the knuckle is completely separated, and then that'll give us really cozy access inside. I believe this will be next, pulling off the sway bar link. So the nut was just spinning and the ball joint was spinning in its socket. So I was able to get a pair of vice grips down in there, and then that held this center shaft in place while I can back this out. So if you have that same issue, a pair of vice grips did the trick for me. All right, we got things opened up pretty well. The knuckle's off. Next is this sway bar link. It's a 14 millimeter. There's a bolt underneath that you can get to, and then this should be just free hanging by, there's a pivot point there, and then one up there we'll get to. Okay, so that came off, so this is just pivoting on its bushings there and there. Now would be a good time to replace these, if just for preventative maintenance, since you got it halfway off anyway. It's just another nut back here, and that comes off. You can get a whole new one. They're pretty cheap. But anyway, so we're gonna take this back off first. Let's see underneath, right here, there's 3 14 millimeter bolts, 1, 2, and 3. We'll zip those off, and that'll take care of the back side. To do the front, there's a 22 millimeter bolt right there, and that goes all the way through. And then on the other side of it is this 22 millimeter nut. So if you're using power tools, if you have a wobbly adapter like this onto your 22, you can get it down below the transmission. If you don't have that wobbly, then you can't really get any power tools in there, so you just have to hand wrench it off. So once you've undone that, this goes all the way through. You just wiggle it, wiggle the control arm up and down, and this just comes out of its hole, and then the control arm is separated and out of the vehicle. And this thing was pretty bent. I'll get the other one and put them side by side so you can see. And these are the control arms side by side. You just want to make sure that any holes, this is for the sway bar links, are going to line up, that the bushings do look the same, and things like that. That's it. Let's go ahead and slap this bad boy back in. So the new control arm is put in. It took quite a bit of wiggling and stuff to get everything lined up, but the bolt in, I don't have the nut on yet, but that'll go on next. And then these 3 in the back are put on. It doesn't get torqued yet, so just go ahead and put your bolts in, snug them down, but it gets torqued at the very end when the weight of the car is on the control arm. Control arms in, those are just snug in place. After that, we could put the knuckle back on. Before we put the steering knuckle back on, we can go ahead and put this sway bar link back in its hole. This isn't getting a new one, but that's up to you if you want to get a new one or not. But anyway, that's the next step. Also, before putting the knuckle back on, now would be a good time if you are replacing the tie rods. Since you have this open space, now would be a good time to just go ahead and do that. So that's what I'm going to do first. So next shot you'll see will be, these will be new. In order to take the inner tie rod off, you have to take this boot off. There's a clip here, so a pair of pliers, and that clip comes off. But in the back, I don't know if I can even get back there to show you. No, not really. Yeah, I can't really get back there, but there's a band on the back that also clamps over the back of it. Kind of similar to how this clamps, but this is can be separated with a pair of pliers. The back can't. So there's a little nub on the clamp. So the clamp goes around, and then there's a little nub that you'll see. What you'll want to do is take a pry bar or a screwdriver, whatever really long you can get back there. Imagine this is the nub. You want to put the screwdriver or the pry bar on the nub and then beat it. And you might have to do that a couple times, but eventually that C-clamp will separate, and then you could pull the whole boot off. And then when you put it back together, you could use a hose clamp, a C-clamp again, but you have to have a special crimping tool, or zip ties. Sometimes you can just get a nice solid zip tie on there, and that'll be good enough. Anyway, that has to come off first. I ended up having to cut mine because it was just bent. And then, so once that's off, I'll show you, there's a tool that you can get from your local auto parts store, or if you have one, but it's a tool that goes over, and then it'll have like a crow's foot on the end, but it's a big long tube. It goes over, and then you can take the inner tie rod off. But I'll show you that in a second. Just so you can see what I was talking about, this is the little band for the back. So that's the boot. It goes on like this, and you'll see this little nub right here. So that's where you want to get either a screwdriver right on that nub, or a pry bar or whatever, something long, because you need to be able to get all the way back in there. But that's it anyway. So you just pop it off. They're not reusable. So Okay, so I lied. I hate when I do that. This is the new inner tie rod. You can see that this is just a round piece. There's no shape on it to put any kind of crow's foot or anything like that. So it was kind of involved. I ended up taking the lower control arm back off just to give me some more room, which it was just finger tight in there anyway. The sway bar link, the sway bar, I ended up unbolting it there and then going to the other side, unbolting it so I can push it back all the way in. So what that ended up doing was giving me enough room to get a pair of channel locks on it and then busting it loose. There may be a better way out there. This is not the best way, probably. I don't know. That's what I ended up having to do because I could not get any kind of leverage anywhere. I tried turning the wheel all the way in one direction, hoping I can find a spot to get a tool in there for leverage, but I couldn't. So this was how I was able to get room to change out that inner tie rod. This is a lot of work, so I'm sure there's a method out there. So that's that. Okay, got the boot back on and the outer tie rod on, and you count threads, so how many times it turned to come off, that's how many times you could put it back on. The outer tie rod can thread back on, and that'll get you in the ballpark. It's gonna get in alignment anyway, and anytime you do tie rods it should get realigned, but that'll get you pretty close. Counting threads, how many times it turned coming out, how many times it goes back in, should be roughly the same. So now we are ready for the steering knuckle to go on. Just a few tips. This black thing is just a cap, so make sure you take that off before you put the knuckle on. And then also go ahead and put some anti-seize on the splines here before you put the knuckle on, and that'll just help in the future if this ever has to come back off again. So now that the steering knuckle is on, the lower ball joint can be tightened up and torqued to 54 foot-pounds. And after you torque it, if it doesn't line up with the cotter pin hole, that's okay. Go ahead and tighten it to the next notch that lines up. Don't loosen it to line it up, just tighten it whatever turn it takes to get the next notch lined up with the hole. So 54 foot-pounds for that, and then a new cotter pin. And then the center axle nut is going to be 203 foot-pounds, which that's quite beastie, but again, that gets a cotter as well. Okay, the spindle nut's back in and cottered, the ball joint back in and cottered. So next you can put in the strut tower, just line it up and those bolts in. Torque on your strut tower is 53 foot-pounds, and then after that's on, you can put your tie rod on, and that doesn't have a torque spec that I found, but just tight and then put a cotter through it. Once that's on, now we can put our rotor back on, and then our caliper, and our caliper bolt is torqued to 70 foot-pounds. Now that all this is on and tight, I forgot to mention the brake hose can go back on, and then that clip goes back in. Once all this is finished, now we can go ahead and torque down our lower control arm. In order to torque down the control arm bolts, the suspension has to be loaded. So in order to do that, what you can do is take your jack, put it under the end of the control arm, and then jack it up until the car comes off the jack stand. And then that'll be as if the car was sitting on the ground and the suspension was loaded. So these three in the back are 50 foot-pounds, and then that one in the front, I can't even see it right here, is 89 foot-pounds. So 50 in the back, 89 in the front. Once those lower control arm in the front and the rear are torqued, double check your work, look over everything, and your job's complete. Put the tire back on, take it for a good test drive, and you're good to go. All right, thanks for watching. See you on the next one.